This is part 2 of our interview with Mike Tuchscherer. If you missed part 1, go back and check it out on PropaneFitness.com, or you can find it on iTunes, YouTube, Android, or Stitcher as well. Otherwise, let's get into part 2. So speaking of the one board press, Mike, you covered this a little bit in your seminar as well. How do you generally program assistance movements when you're using an RPE-based approach for the main lifts?
So the first thing that we want to do when we're figuring out assistance and supplemental exercises is to figure out, to the best of our knowledge, what does the athlete need? If we have a good record of what they've done in the past and we can kind of separate out as many of those variables as we can get a good idea of what that would be. But in the case where we're working with someone new, or it's a different training strategy, or maybe they just switched from conventional to sumo or something like that, you don't have that sort of record yet. So the best place to start is from a weakness analysis. So we watch how the lifter moves. The heavier the weight, the better. So ideally it would be like a limit weight in competition, and watch how that lift is performed. And we're trying to find two things. The first thing is their weak range of motion. So their weak range of motion is not really the sticking point. A lot of people kind of confuse it with the sticking point is that being their weakness. In actuality, the sticking point is a comparatively strong position because there's an initial force that's produced in the bottom of the lift, and that's what gets the bar moving. So you accelerate the bar in the bottom. That's how it goes from stop to some velocity. And then it has a peak velocity. Usually, let's talk about the bench press. So you push the bar off your chest in the bench press. And the peak velocity usually happens pretty quickly after the bar gets moving off the chest. And then the bar starts to slow down. And it'll slow down up to that sticking point. And the sticking point, like I said, is kind of where we conceptually think of as the weak range of motion, but it's really the end of the weak range of motion. What we're looking for is, where does the bar slow down the most? Where all that speed bleeds off the most, that's the weakest range of motion. So we want to figure that out. We want to find that weakest range of motion. And that's going to give us a really good indication of what exercises to do to train that weak range of motion. So keeping with the bench press example, if I see that you lose the most speed about 5 centimeters from your chest, that's where the speed really starts to bleed off. Now, it's not that much, but that's right about a one board level. So I would want to do things to cause more strength adaptation in that specific position. So in that position where the bar is 5 centimeters off your chest. So some things that you might do to do that would be board presses, a one board press. Now you could do them touch and go and try to utilize the stretch reflex to get more force production in that position. Or you could do a long pause at that position to increase your time under tension. There's a bunch of different ways that you can kind of attack that particular joint angle. This past training cycle, I've been experimenting with isometrics for myself to see if I personally get a training effect from it. So that would be another thing that you could do. So you're going to want to do that for all three lifts and come up with some exercises that target that weak range of motion. And then as far as the supplemental exercises go, supplemental exercises tend to focus more on muscles and not so much on movements. So we want to figure out what muscle is most responsible for that position, and or in the case of the squat and to some extent the deadlift, for that kind of movement compensation, and figure out what muscle is responsible for that, and then train that muscle. So what we see a lot of people do in the squat is, they squat down, and then when they get to the bottom, their hips rise and their chest falls. And they kind of do this little good morning thing. Also, a lot of times it's accompanied by the knees shifting back. So there's kind of this whole pattern going on with the knees moving back, the hips come up, and the chest falls forward. Well, pretty much everybody does that, because what it indicates is that your quads are not strong enough to push you up. So that by shifting your weight further back without actually moving the bar up, you're shifting more of the weight, more of the load to your glutes. So it's a compensation pattern for weak quads. Now that makes sense because the squat requires really, really, really strong quads. So for most people, most of the time, that's what we see in the squat. So when we come to supplemental exercises for the squat, we're training things that target the quads. That's where front squat variations come into play. If you have it, a belt squat. But I even have people do leg press and hack squats, which are somewhat powerlifting taboo, or at least they used to be. But training the quads directly and specifically, adding 20 pounds to your leg press probably isn't going to make your squat go up a whole lot, but doing leg press and developing quad strength will enable you to train the squat more effectively, and that will make your squat go up.
That's another really interesting point, that it's not about the direct relationship, it's how can it help you train the squat better and more technically correct, so that you then can get more out of squatting.
Would you program a leg press using an RPE based prescription?
Yeah, generally. Okay. The RPE tends to be a bit looser. I mean, not in the prescription, but more in my expectation.
Right.
So I'll tell someone do 10 reps at a 9 RPE, but if they're between 8 and 10, then that's probably good enough for the training effect that we're trying to create.
It's still just a way of discussing intensity, I suppose, isn't it? In a way that both people can understand, rather than a heavy set of 10.
Look, I want you to do a leg press. I want you to do 10 reps, and I want it to be pretty hard.
Yeah. Yeah. That could mean two very different things, couldn't it, I suppose?
Well, it can, and that's another benefit, I think, of the RPE, is that it allows for much more clear communication. If I tell you I want it to be pretty hard, do I mean pretty hard, or do I mean pretty hard?
Like, do I have to be bleeding?
Let's just say 9 RPE, and that's very clear.
Yeah.
Funny that Johnny's just hit his elbow to an 8 RPE. The hack squat being powerlifting taboo as well. Like, I started hack squatting recently because of a back injury, and bloody hell, like such deep soreness. So I certainly
it's like a lactic burn, isn't it? It's not like nothing else.
So definitely a convert to that, and I can attest that I can't see how that wouldn't make your quad stronger.
What's the weirdest exercise you've ever prescribed, Mike?
The weirdest one. I've done some tempo variations of the lift that are pretty odd, like 5-3-0 tempo. So 5 seconds down, a 3-second pause, and then 0 on the way up. So that one's pretty weird. Let's see. Other stuff is not so weird, I guess, like side lunges and stuff like that. But I do try to get people to move in some different planes of movement. Just this past training cycle, I've done Jefferson deadlifts myself, which that's pretty weird for most of us.
Is that straddling the bar with the bar between your legs?
Right. Yeah. Bar between your legs. Probably not for the shorter armed among us, but but for me, it doesn't seem to be a problem.
Incidentally, how do you feel about Jefferson Curls? I don't know if you've heard of them. It's like a gymnastics rehab movement where you're kind of... You might have seen it under a different name, where you're standing with a bar at lockout, usually empty bar, and then roll your spine down and flex it back up again. It's not... Have you come across that?
I've not come across it. It sounds like a whole lot of loaded spinal flexion.
Yeah, I think I was just asking because of your you said you had a back injury. I don't know whether it was something that you'd seen as a rehab thing. It's not meant to be really loaded. It's just
a
kind of
mobility thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
I see. Well, yeah, I mean, that's definitely injuries. When we start talking about injuries, if I'm going to speak on it with any expertise, I need to bring in people who can tell me what I need to be saying. But we have a physical therapist that works with us to help us, navigate injuries and stuff like that. So that's something that I think is really important. Now, I've also been working with some physical therapists to deal with my back injury. One of the things that we've been doing has been avoiding especially loaded flexion, but for me, anytime I get into a position where I've got shear forces on my spine, that's basically the only time that I get pain. So avoiding that has been really useful to keeping me training. So things like the high bar squat has been pretty much pain free. And then, like, speaking of the Jefferson Deadlift, if you've never done the Jefferson Deadlift, like I hadn't, it feels a lot like a trap bar deadlift because your center of gravity is much further back. The center of gravity is not in front of you like it is for a normal deadlift. It feels like a trap bar deadlift, but you're maybe just slightly twisted. It's a really interesting movement. It's worth giving a try. But I can do that movement with no pain because my center of gravity is further back and I can stay more vertical. So I'm not getting as much shear. So for me, kind of avoiding those things that are putting me in a position of pain has been helpful.
Must be great having a physical therapist as well on board. We call them physiotherapists on the in the UK. But yeah, like is that partly what's influenced things like the side lunges and stuff that's in a different plane to the big three lifts?
Yeah, so the longer we do this, and I've noticed this with a lot of the people on our coaching staff as well, the longer we do this, the more attention and effort we put into injury prevention. And that's been a major catalyst for those side lunges and suitcase deadlifts and things of that nature. That stuff stems from this idea of, like, let's keep people healthy and durable. And honestly, almost all the really weird stuff, so like the weird tempos and stuff like that, come from a place of preventing injury more so than anything else.
Cool.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we chatted about this very, very briefly before coming on air with you, but we did just want to ask you very quickly about your diet approach. I suppose we can mesh that into just how you balance your training and with, like, the rest of your life, I suppose, because it's ultimately what I think a lot of people, especially with powerlifting, if the sessions are very long, like, they struggle with that as they get more advanced. So, firstly, with diet, I remember you mentioning again at the seminar that your diet approach is very simple. And you occasionally keep track of protein and calories, and you maintain your weight. So you've obviously never found diet to be a limitation in your training.
Right. And it's strange because I see that other people, so very assuredly do find it to be a limitation. And I just never have. And to the introspective part of me wonders if I'm missing something, like, man, people put all this effort into diet, and they're like, oh, today was a low carb day, and so my performance in the gym suffered. And I'm thinking, like, I did intermittent fasting and for a long time, and so I would train after having like one meal of a few hundred calories or something like that, and I felt fine. Well, honestly, in hindsight, I see some things that maybe were indicators that diet was affecting my training then that I didn't realize at the time. So hopefully it's a thing that I'm getting better at, but I definitely haven't deluded myself into thinking I'm a nutrition expert either.
So you mentioned
what
that
I do
you
think
didn't...
though is that I think that you've got a limited amount of attention, and if you're going to spend that much time, effort, attention into your training, then you want to spend as little as possible on diet without causing your diet to interfere with your training. At the point where diet is becoming a limiting factor for your training, then obviously you've got to put more attention into it. If you can't make weight, or you've not been able to add any muscle mass because you refuse to eat any protein, then okay, we have some dietary issues that clearly need to be addressed. But I guess I suppose I think about it like mobility. So mobility for a powerlifter, if you're mobile enough to do the lifts with, say, 10% additional range of motion, then you're going to limit your ability, or you limit your risk of injury you're still able to perform the lifts. You're limiting your risk of injury, so you don't really need to spend more time and energy focusing on mobility, And I suppose I think of diet in sort of a similar vein, like put enough effort and energy into it so that it's not a limiting factor, so that it's improving your results in training. But if it's not limiting you, then that's all the effort that you need to spend on it.
I suppose for a powerlifter, the focus is, I'll arrange my food in a way that allows me to lift the most weight over time and continue to lift more weight over time. When that stops happening, I need to look at my nutrition. I know there's a lot of people where it's very trendy, certainly here in the UK, to sit kind of over a weight class and do drastic water cuts to make weight and things like that, even just at regional competitions. And I think that's popularized by a few guys who are at world level who are doing that kind of thing. I'm assuming, I think you mentioned that you just maintain like around your weight class pretty much.
So to me, preparing for a competition, especially like those last couple of weeks, there's more stress in that than I give it credit for, and I can notice it in my mood more than anything else. That I become more irritable as we get closer to a competition. Things like that, and I try not to be a jerk about it. So hopefully no one else notices. Maybe my wife, but but it's a thing that I notice about myself, and so adding in, a strict weight cut on top of that is just adding more stress and more tension to the whole system. So for me personally, I prefer to have easier weight cuts. I would rather do a longer weight cut that's more gentle than a severe weight cut there at the end. And sort of the same thing like we do for a lot of competitors, especially if they're trying to drop into a weight class. We'll use water loading at the end, but it's pretty tame compared to what a lot of people do. For a 2-hour weigh-in, I don't think there's a whole lot that you want to do. I suppose that there's plenty that you can do, but to me it becomes an issue of probability. Is this, like, you might be able to do this more severe cut and it might not affect your strength so much if you do everything perfectly and, if the dice roll is correct and all that. But if you do it, more gently, if you have a slightly easier weight cut, then it improves your chances of having a good performance at the end. So for me, I would rather take the more likely over the more aggressive.
I think that makes sense, that you're just throwing in another spanner in the works on top of meet prep by trying to cut and so on. And I think if you don't have to do it, then amateur lifters who are sitting above their weight category, like, they've got less of an excuse really. So and I also like the approach to diet as well, just saying like put in as much attention as needed, but no more than that. And we're very much a fan of that kind of Occam's razor philosophy.
And especially for the more novice type lifters, having periods where you're focused on gaining muscle and allowing your weight to go up and not getting married to a specific weight class early in your career, I think that's really important to your long-term development. So you start out at 60 some odd kilos, then like hopefully you don't end there. Part of the idea is that you get stronger, and for most of us, especially most guys, they want to add some more muscle during that time as well. So you've got to be willing to add a bit of weight.
It's a problem, and I've certainly fell into that where for too long I was attached to the 74 kilo weight category, just because as you're getting heavier, you start, you become stronger in that category, and before you outgrow it, you feel like this kind of big dick pimp player. But you think like I've got to grow up into the higher category, but you have to take it on the chin and end up at the lower end of it for a few years. So you said you were worried about, or that you were taking into account the impact on your wife and so on when you're going through meet prep, and that it's more stress than you give it credit for. How do you balance training and diet alongside family life?
I think I have a pretty easy time of it compared to most people, to be honest. So because this is my job, I can look at training as part of my job as well. So I do my training Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday. I do it in the afternoon. So I get up early and I start work early. And kind of in the early afternoon, I break away from work and I go lift weights. And by the time everyone's home in the evening, I'm done for the day. So I do get to spend quite a bit of time with my family, and I've arranged my schedule so that, I'm not training on weekends and things like that. But that's just kind of how don't get me wrong, I've been very fortunate to be able to arrange my life this way, and I know that a lot of people just don't have that as a possibility. But it's also kind of evolved this way over the years. Like when I started out, I knew what what me and my wife's home expectations were, that we like to have weekends together. So even then, I didn't really train much on the weekends. I would try to keep all my training confined to the work week. And then in the beginning, when I still had I guess you call it a more normal job, although I was in the Air Force, so it really wasn't all that normal. A lot of times I would get up very early in the morning and start lifting weights by 5 a.m. or something like that in order to preserve that time. So to me, a lot of it's about priorities. Everyone has the same 24 hours in a day. It's just prioritizing how do you want to spend that time.
So Mike, very selfishly, my job is basically the same. I do this full time as well. I'd love to know a bit more about kind of like what a day in the life looks like for you. Like you mentioned, you wake up early, you work during the day. I've experimented with, like you, and this is probably going to annoy a lot of people listening, but like I could train whenever I wanted theoretically. I always find it difficult to break away at a specific time of the day. Do you just have a work day that happens earlier and finishes earlier and then train?
Yeah, kind of. So I get up. I suppose more often than not, I'm up by 5, at least by 6, and I go down to the office and get some work done. Try to get some work done before my son wakes up. Then by the time he wakes up, I'm helping him get ready for daycare while my wife's getting ready for work, and she drives him to daycare on her way to work. So once they leave the house, I go back to work, and I have my day up until around 1, maybe 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And then by then, my brain is pretty much shot anyway. So, I find that I have a limited number of useful hours to sit in front of the computer. And when that's over, like I'm just sitting here drooling on myself anyway. So
absolutely. Sounds familiar.
I totally get what you're saying though. It's difficult to break away from it. Even then, because I feel like I ought to be doing something, or I'm really mentally tired and I just don't feel like going to the gym. But eventually that break has to happen. You get up out of the chair. I either go to the basement or there's a gym downtown that I go to. I try to keep that mixed up a bit. And so I go down there, I train, and get done in time to pick my son up from daycare and head home.
Awesome. I wish so much that I could do that, but for some reason, I don't know what it is. I'd struggle to finish at 1 o'clock, I think. But that's cool.
Yeah,
that's cool.
Well, it's kind of awkward to end your workday at kind of early afternoon like that, and I think it necessitates an early start.
Of course. Do you have any tips for waking up at 5 in the morning?
No, not really. I've just done it for a long time now. When I was a cadet at the Air Force Academy, I would get up at 4:30 and be at the gym by 5. And that's a rough way to live life, man. Let me tell you.
So the tip is join the Air Force, and then 5 a.m. feels like a bit of a lie-in.
There you go, yeah.
Great.
Wake up at 4 for a year, and then 5 a.m. is easy.
Snooze until 5. Right.
Yeah.
When the recruiter asks you, what are your motivations for joining, telling you it's going to be good for my powerlifting.
Well, in a year from now, I'd like to wake up at 5 a.m. So this is the easiest way for me for me to create that habit.
Most roundabout way.
Any time. So I know Yusuf at the minute. You train in the morning. Mm. I used to train in the morning and found eventually that the intensity of my training, especially leading up to competitions, was just too I just couldn't face it at that time.
Yeah.
It's different. I'm not really doing spinal loading in the morning, so it's
Yusef does curls, essentially, is what he's saying. Because he's had a back injury, so he's like, I know what I'm going to do.
Arms every day.
Competitive curls.
Yeah.
I may be signing up with you.
But back onto sort of nutrition not affecting your training. Do you ever find sleep is a recovery limitation? Like, especially waking up that early, are you always getting 8 hours a night, or is that something that you just kind of know?
No, I mean, I honestly, here's another helpful life tip from Mike. If you want to go to bed early, have a kid.
So join the Air Force and have a kid.
Right, there you go.
Write that down.
Right, but no, honestly, having a 2-year-old does help, because I put him to bed in the evening, so I end up falling asleep about 3/4 of the time. So I go to bed pretty early in the evening, which is helpful. But to be honest, I mean, there are periods of time where work is more busy, so you find yourself getting up earlier than normal, and sleep definitely goes on the back burner during those times. In my case, when travel picks up, that's another one of those times. And typically I just kind of do that until I wear myself in the ground and get sick. So it's not really a great example to follow, I think. But that's usually what happens when I'm not getting enough sleep, is that it's going to end in me getting a cold, and that's no fun. So it's a good motivator for getting rest, I guess.
It's quite interesting to hear that you're obviously a very high level powerlifter, but your focus on things that I think a lot of people would think were crucial is actually quite low. You put a lot of time in your training, but diet and sleep, they support it, but they're not focuses for you.
I think you'll find that with a lot of higher level powerlifters kind of follow the same sort of thing. Like, sleep is nice, and sleep is fun, and I'm going to try my best to get that. But, just kind of modern life being what it is, it's hard. Or, diet, for a lot of guys, I think, is just kind of eat whatever I can and make sure I'm still in my weight class, and that's about it,
That's really interesting. Mike, I don't want to take up too much of your time, but we just got one more question as well.
Sure.
It's not a would you rather, don't worry.
Although it can be.
Yeah, so I remember seeing something where you showed a difference over the years of your technique and how you were kind of developing that, and I know you're big on this. What would you recommend people do to master their craft, and what's the advantage of honing your technique to the point of like ultimate Tuchscherer precision?
Well, so it's interesting. I think, especially in the beginning, there's definitely things that you need to do. There are cues that you need, and you need to focus on executing the lift properly and fluidly and things like that. But I run across a surprising number of lifters who post videos online looking for technical feedback or things like that, and you watch the video, and like I'll watch it and I'll look at it and I think, there are a few things that are not quite polished with this lift, but they're not things that need to be cued differently. It's just that this lifter needs 5 or 10 more years of practice with squatting, or whatever lift it is that we're talking about. There are definitely aspects of technique that need to be cued. And okay, so you're rounding your back in your squat, so you need to set your start differently, and you need to think about this, or push this way, or flex that. That's fine, but when you're coming out of the hole, there's a very slight wobble right as you pass parallel. That's probably not a thing that you need to cue any differently. You just need to generally try to not do that and practice for a long time, and that'll fix itself. I think when we get to the point where we see those very subtle and very minor things that just kind of polish themselves out with a lot of practice, if we try to cue those anyway, I think what we end up with are those people that we talked about that end up getting so hyper focused on having absolutely perfect technique that they kind of forget to put more weight on the bar. They kind of forget that strength's the name of the game, and I've got to put weight on the bar to get stronger. Some of those things are, like I said, they'll just polish things. They're going to buff out with time. It's the more, I guess, significant errors. So if you have an error with your setup, then that's something that you absolutely should fix. If you have an error on the descent, then that's something that you probably should look into getting fixed, cueing differently. If you have an error on the concentric, that's a gray area, I find, for a lot of people. Now, that's just a rule of thumb as well. There's definitely exceptions on all sorts of different ends. But if you're doing everything right, you've got a good setup, you've got a good descent, you've got a good solid bottom position, but then on the way up there's just kind of some small thing that's just not quite right, then that's probably, just generally try to do better, and it's going to get better with time.
It's funny, the advice sounds very similar to I've had a few golf lessons in my time, despite being terrible at golf, and something that a lot of teachers say is kind of the backswing, getting into position, very technically focused, but once you're at a certain point in the downswing, just swing the club. And I think squatting, especially squatting, is very similar. If you're in a good position out of the hole, you just need to complete the rep to some degree. Worrying about where is my hip, where are my hands, you'll end up missing the rep. So
I totally feel that way on the deadlift. It's like if you can bottle up all this tightness and kind of squeeze it and compress it together and get yourself in a bottom position that's perfect, from there you just stand up. It's just stand up. Like there's nothing more to think about, just stand up. But it turns out that getting into that perfect bottom position is actually really taxing.
I remember, have you ever heard of Tom Martin?
Yeah.
You probably have, yeah. So his I remember reading on a forum him talking about, everyone's like, Tom, how do I squat? And his comment was something like, I put the bar on my back, I bend down, and I hope that I can stand back up again. It's like, for someone who's now squatting, 360 or whatever it is, for that to be, I'm sure
to some extent, I think that's about it. Let's not lose the sight of, let's not lose sight and try to make the simple things complicated.
So just to wrap up, Mike, just try quite hard with lifting. Diet doesn't really matter that much, and just sleep if you can.
And join the Air Force.
Join the Air Force and have a kid. Great.
Most unhelpful interview ever.
Life advice.
Mike, it's been fantastic. How can we find more of your content, and how can people catch up on what you're up to?
Well, probably the best way, we have a website. It's reactivetrainingsystems.com. And I mentioned a training log before. We have a free training log that's available on that site. Also, we have several other free tools, free bodyweight tracking, free athlete monitoring through our track system. And so it's worth checking that out and checking out the app section of that site to see the different web applications. We're working on that literally full time. So there's pretty regularly new stuff coming out. We just came out with a workout planner that kind of goes back through your training log, finds the best data reference point, and helps you pick the best target weight for today.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, so we're always kind of we have a lot of ideas, so we're always doing new stuff like that. So reactivetrainingsystems.com is the website, but I'm also pretty active on Facebook and Instagram. I'm pretty easy to find on both of those platforms as well. So I don't think anyone should have any trouble.
So I struggled to add you on Skype with spelling your last name. So we'll include that in the notes.
What, Mike's Skype handle? I'm sure he'll really appreciate that.
Yeah, just send him a message anytime. We'll so show notes will be on the website propanefitness.com. You can check this out on YouTube if you're listening to this on iTunes. And check out Mike T, follow him, and we'll speak to everyone next time.
Didn't want you to ask a question and then there not be a whole lot behind it, you know?
Like, Mike, what is...
Didn't want you to ask a question and then there not be a whole lot behind it, you know?
Like, Mike, what is...
Didn't want you to ask a question and then there not be a whole lot behind it, you know?
Like, Mike, what is...
Didn't want you to ask a question and then there not be a whole lot behind it, you know?
Like, Mike, what is...
Didn't want you to ask a question and then there not be a whole lot